without any decent evidence, at least equally good historical evidence to the contrary, the historian at least must conclude that Jesus was crucified and that the process killed him. In a nutshell, the evidence we have for the resurrection of Jesus, we go by facts and then we look at method. So facts, we could just say, here are 3 facts upon which virtually 100% of scholars, including skeptical ones, agree. That would be Jesus' death by crucifixion, that shortly after his death, a number of his followers had experiences of some sort, of some nature, that convinced them Jesus had been raised from the dead and had appeared to them personally. Now, that is not to say these scholars acknowledge that Jesus had risen and appeared to them, but they still say the evidence is still good to show that these disciples had experiences that made them believe Jesus rose and had appeared to them. And then third, there was a persecutor of the church, an enemy of Jesus named Paul, who was arresting Christians, throwing them in prison, consenting to their executions for being Christians, and then he became one when he had an experience he believed was the appearance of Jesus, the risen Jesus appearing to him. Now, what historians do is they take these facts and they formulate numerous hypotheses that attempt to account for those facts. And the hypothesis that it best accounts for those facts is regarded by historians as what probably occurred. The hypothesis that Jesus' resurrection was just a metaphor to say that his teachings and memories still live on, or that it's a metaphor for saying Jesus was vindicated by God in heaven. All of these hypotheses fail to explain the known historical data as well as the resurrection hypothesis. When we come to the resurrection narratives, you have a lot of critics who have pointed out what they think are contradictions. So, for example, was there one angel or were there 2 angels at the empty tomb? How many women went to the tomb? Was it just Mary Magdalene, like the Gospel of John seems to suggest, or were there multiple women, and so forth? Well, what's interesting, I think what's being used here is a compositional device called literary spotlighting. Literary spotlighting is when an author knows that there are multiple people involved, but they shine their literary spotlight by only mentioning their main character or a certain person, while not mentioning the others. So this is very common. In fact, in Plutarch's Lives, it's probably the most common literary device I saw him using. So when we come to the resurrection narratives, think about this. You have Mark followed by Matthew report 1 angel at the tomb, while Luke and John report 2 angels at the tomb. Could it be that Mark, followed by Matthew, is using literary spotlighting and shining the spotlight on the angel who's making the announcement of the resurrection? Or what about the women who went to the tomb? Maybe John is shining his literary spotlight on Mary Magdalene because she was the most important of all the women who went to the tomb. In fact, this seems to be the case because she runs back and tells Peter and the beloved disciple, they have taken the Lord and we don't know where they've laid him. Who's we? So when you look at the resurrection narratives, when you look at the passion narratives, when you look all throughout the Gospels, you find these compositional devices that were part and parcel of writing ancient biography easily and very comfortably explains more than 90% of all these perceived contradictions in the Gospels.
Well, we have a great deal of evidence, and we also have eyewitness testimony. And from a historical point of view, eyewitness testimony is extremely important, where we don't have to just connect the dots through inference, but we actually know what people saw and experienced. And so what we have then are 4 accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, at least 2 streams of independent tradition. Probably 3. You have something in Luke, you have something in Mark that Matthew shares, and then you have something in John. So I would say we probably have 3 independent streams of tradition talking about the resurrection and who saw the risen Jesus and so forth. But you also have Paul, and so we're not being told about what Paul saw. Paul tells us what he saw. So Paul himself is a first-hand witness, and then he talks about others who saw the risen Jesus, such as Peter, the most important of Jesus' 12 apostles. He also says all the apostles saw him, including Jesus' brother James, who later became the head of the church in Jerusalem. And then Paul makes a very remarkable statement. He says more than 500 people at one time saw Jesus. And I think that rules out the idea of it's all based on a rumor or some kind of emotional experience or subjective vision or something like that. So we have firsthand eyewitness testimony. Then, of course, we have the narratives in the Gospels. And what tells me the Gospels are telling the truth is just the way the story is told. For example, they say women came to the tomb. Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene first. Well, women were not held in high esteem as witnesses or legal people or anything like that in antiquity. If you're trying to convince people, why have women come to the tomb who are confused and frightened? That's not a very good way of telling the story. That tells me they're telling the truth. They're saying, well, you like it or not, that's what happened. And so they're committed to the truth. So I find that important. But also I go back to what the archaeologist Jody Magnus said. Jody is Jewish. She's not Christian, so there's not some kind of theological motivation here. She looks at the gospel narratives of Jesus' death, his burial, and Sunday morning, the discovery of the empty tomb, and she says, you know, that actually fits the way the Jewish burial traditions worked back then. That's what they did. So the Gospels are telling a very realistic, very truthful story. So when you take all those pieces together, eyewitness testimony, the verisimilitude, the reality of the way the story is told in the Gospels, and you put it all together, I think it puts a very heavy burden of proof on the skeptic who says, yeah, but I don't think he was resurrected. Let's explain it some other way. They all went to the wrong tomb, or Jesus wasn't dead at all. He just woke up and got out of the tomb.